The mop moved in slow, deliberate arcs. Daniel Carter had learned, over 14 months of doing this, that the secret to a clean floor was patience, not pressure. You didn't scrub marble. You guided water across it. You let the soap do the work. He moved through the grand atrium of Veritech Financial Technologies, the way water moves through a riverbed, quietly, efficiently, without disturbing a single stone. It was 11 minutes past 9 on a Friday night. Outside, the city had buried itself under 6 inches of fresh snow. The wind off the harbor had turned the kind of cold that didn't just chill your skin but got into the architecture of your joints and stayed there. Inside, Veritech's headquarters blazed with the cold white light of a company in motion, the 43rd floor fully lit, the security team cycling through their hourly rounds, the cleaning crew of 3 working their way up from the lobby. Daniel was the only one assigned to the atrium. He preferred it that way. He was 38 years old, 5'11", lean from skipped lunches rather than any deliberate discipline. His hair had started going gray at the temples sometime around his daughter's 6th birthday, which he'd celebrated in a waiting room outside a pediatric specialist's office. He wore the standard-issue gray uniform of Meridian Facilities Management. The name tag on his chest read D. Carter in block letters that had started to peel at the edges. The atrium was the architectural heart of Veritech's headquarters, 60 feet of soaring glass and polished black marble. The company logo, a stylized circuit board rendered in brushed silver, occupied an entire wall behind the reception desk. Visitors entered here and immediately understood that they were standing inside something powerful, something that had been designed, very deliberately, to make them feel small. Daniel did not feel small. He felt tired. He worked the mop in practice sweeps, eyes forward, moving toward the eastern corridor where a cluster of Veritech's junior analysts were still at their desks, visible through the glass partition. 3 of them, late 20s, expensive watches, the particular brand of exhausted arrogance that came from working 80-hour weeks and believing it made them important. He'd learned to recognize that look. One of them, a young man named Trevor, whose last name Daniel had never learned and didn't particularly want to, had started talking. Not quietly. Trevor had the conversational volume of someone who'd grown up assuming the room belonged to him. And Kowalski actually asked the maintenance guy if he'd seen the Parsons report, Trevor was saying, not looking up from his monitor. Like, asked him. Guys mopping the floor. Laughter from the other 2. What did maintenance guy say? One of the others asked. Nothing. Probably didn't know what a report was. More laughter. I'm just saying, it's a different category of human being. You look at a guy like that, what's he got going on up there? It's not mean, it's just biological reality. The 3rd analyst, a young woman who had the grace to look mildly uncomfortable, said, Trevor. Come on, I'm being empirical, Trevor said. With the confidence of someone who had recently discovered the word empirical and was using it as a shield. Daniel stopped mopping, not because he was angry. He'd stopped being angry about this particular flavor of contempt sometime around his 7th month on the job. He stopped because he'd noticed something on the terminal screen visible through the glass partition. Trevor's screen, angled slightly outward, displaying what looked like a real-time dashboard. Market positions. A liquidity waterfall model, and at the bottom of that screen, a number that had no business being that size. The number was negative. He looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then he continued mopping. Trevor said something else. Daniel didn't hear it. He was running calculations. Sophia Blake came through the main doors at 9:22, brushing snow from her coat with the efficient impatience of a woman who had things to do and considered weather an administrative inconvenience. She was 36, with the kind of controlled energy that filled a room without announcing itself. Her hair was dark, pulled back with the precision of someone who had learned that details signal competence. Her coat was charcoal gray. Her expression said that she was already thinking about 7 things and had no available bandwidth for an 8th. She passed Daniel without looking at him. This was not contempt, it was the functional invisibility that the powerful extend to the invisible. Daniel had come to understand the distinction. She was almost to the elevator bank when Trevor's voice carried clearly through the glass. Different category of human being. That's all I'm saying. Sophia paused. Half a step. Her eyes moved to the glass partition, registered the cluster of analysts, registered Daniel moving his mop a few feet away. Her jaw tightened, something happened behind her eyes, some brief private calculation, and then she kept walking. The elevator doors opened and swallowed her. Daniel watched the floor. The marble was very clean. He thought about Lily, asleep by now in their apartment 3 train stops and 1 bus transfer away. He thought about the prescription sitting on the kitchen counter that he hadn't filled yet because he needed to move $43 from one account to another, and the bank app kept declining the transfer. He thought about the number he'd seen on Trevor's screen. He thought, I should say something. He thought, it's not your business. He thought, it's definitely not your business. He finished the atrium and moved to the east corridor, and the number stayed in his head, turning slowly, the way a bad thought does when you try not to look at it directly. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had been built in 1967 and updated in 1991 and not significantly touched since. The radiator worked intermittently. The windows let in winter through the gaps around their frames that Daniel had stuffed with towels last November. The kitchen light flickered when the refrigerator cycled on. It was home. He got in at 12:47 in the morning. The bus had been late, then the heat on the bus had failed somewhere around the 3rd stop, and the last 6 stops had been endured in a cold that made the gap between moving and not moving feel negotiable. He unlocked the door quietly and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. From behind Lily's door, nothing. The particular nothing of a child deeply asleep. He exhaled. The kitchen was small enough that you could stand in the center and touch both the counter and the stove. He put the kettle on, not because he wanted tea, but because the ritual of it, the specific task, the boiling, the waiting helped his mind settle from work mode back into the place where he could think clearly. He'd learned this about himself years ago, in a different life, when the thinking he needed to do was worth considerably more per hour. On the counter, the prescription bottle. Dr. Hartwell's recommended dosage. Lily's twice-daily medication for the bronchial condition that had started when she was 6 and had never fully resolved. Not dangerous, doctor. Hartwell had been careful to say not dangerous multiple times, in the way that doctors say things when they want to make sure you've heard them, but persistent. Manageable with medication. Expensive to manage. The refill cost $187 with his current insurance, which covered 40% of the medication cost and exactly none of the specialist visits. Daniel sat down at the kitchen table with his tea and opened the laptop that lived there. It was 5 years old and loaded slowly, and the fan ran loud. But the processing it needed to do was modest. He opened the browser, navigated to a financial news aggregator, and read for 20 minutes. He read about Veritech. There was a piece from 3 days ago, Veritech's Meridian Algorithm Positions Company, for $3. To-be acquisition landmark that he read twice. The writing was confident. The underlying assumptions, which he could reconstruct from the publicly available information, were not. He closed the laptop. He sat with his tea and listened to the radiator and thought about the number he'd seen on Trevor's screen. The specific shape of that negative number. The particular column it had been sitting in. It's not your business, he told himself again. The radiator knocked twice and went quiet. He thought about the day 8 years ago when he'd walked out of the building he'd helped build, not the one he now mopped, but the financial infrastructure that Veritech still ran on, the algorithmic architecture that underwrote their entire operation. He'd walked out because his wife, Caroline, had received a diagnosis that required his full presence, and full presence was incompatible with the life he'd been living. He'd made the choice without drama, filed the paperwork, transferred his equity, left. Caroline had died anyway, 2 years later. The diagnosis had been more aggressive than the initial prognosis suggested, and he'd been left with Lily, 4 years old and frightened, and his entire